Okay, welcome to today's Daf Yomi, which is Kesubos Daf Yomi, Kesubos 30. Probably the best way to start this is by starting in the middle of Chavtes Amabeis, where around 15 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara is discussed. That the Mishnah has talked about the concept that if a person assaults a mamzeres or his sister, he still has to pay the 50 shekel coins. So the Gemara says that our Mishnah is lafuke mehaitana. That the Gemara says that our Mishnah is coming to exclude the position of the following brisa. The Tanya, we learned in the brisa, it says in the verse that after somebody assaults a woman, he is required to marry her. Velo siel isha. He has to marry her. She has to be for him for a wife. And Shimon Timni Omer, and Shimon the Timni taught Isha sheyesh ba'avaya. In order to be obligated to pay the 50 silver coins, it has to be a woman for whom, if you try to marry her, the marriage is binding. Whereas Rabbi Shimon Manasseh disagrees. He says Isha ru'yo l'kaima. Not that the marriage is binding. That's not enough to make you have to pay the fine. It has to be a marriage that you're allowed to remain in the marriage, that you're not required to divorce. And my benai, what's the distinction between the opinions of Shimon Timni and Shimon ben Manasseh? The distinction between them, according to Rabbi Zera, is a mamzeres and a sina. The case of a person who assaults a mamzeres or a sina, these are both women who you're not allowed to marry. Amanda Amar, according to Shimon Timni, it says it has to be Isha sheyesh ba'avaya, woman who the marriage is valid with. Well, in this case, Anami yesh ba'avaya. In this case, the marriage will be binding, even though you're required to divorce her, and so therefore, for this reason, you have to pay the kanas. Alman Damar or Shimon ben Manasseh, who states Ru'uyel Kaima, it has to be a marriage that you're allowed to remain in. Ayin Ru'uyel Kaima, you're not able to remain in this marriage. You have to divorce her, and so therefore, you wouldn't pay the kanas. So the Gemara says, well, but what about according to Rabbi Akiva, who says Ein Kiddushin Tovsim Achai V'Lav, and according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that by any prohibition, even by a mamzeres, the Kiddushin is not binding, and so therefore, what's the reason why Shimon ben Manasseh, according to Rabbi Akiva, says Isha Ru'il Kaima? How would his position be explained according to Rabbi Akiva? What's the distinction between him and Shimon Timni? So the Gemara explains, Rabbi Akiva says, "Ein Kiddushin Tovsim Achai V'Lav, my benayo, Ika benayo." The difference between Shimon Timni and Shimon ben Manasseh is an almana l'kohen gadol, is a widow to a high priest. Rabbi Simai, and according to the position of Rabbi Simai, the time Rabbi Simai says, when I call this Rabbi Akiva mamzer, Rabbi Akiva would say every prohibited marriage, every marriage for which there's a prohibition, Rabbi Akiva says not a binding marriage, and the offspring is a mamzer. Chutz me'almana l'kohen gadol, the exception of a widow who marries a high priest. Shari'em Torah lo yikach v'lo yichalel. The Torah says you can't not allowed to marry her, so you don't desecrate your kahuna. Chilul and huose. If you marry such a woman, an almana to a kohen gadol, if you marry such a woman, it makes the offspring not a kohen, ve'eno sem mamzerin, but not a mamzer. So Rabbi Akiva says there is. So according to Rabbi Simai, Rabbi Akiva says there is one case where the marriage is prohibited, where it's still binding, and that's the case of a widow to a kohen gadol. So that's where Shimon Timni says if the kohen gadol assaults a widow, he pays the kanas, and Shimon Manasseh says he wouldn't pay the kanas. Gemara says, well, what about according to Rabbi Yeshivav? According to Rabbi Yeshivav, who states, Bo v'nitzvach al Akiva ben Yosef, come what scream at Akiva ben Yosef, Shayomer kol she'en lo bia b'Yisrael avan mamzer. He says anybody who does not have an offspring amongst the Jewish people, the offspring is a mamzer. So if that's the case, Rabbi Yeshivav disagrees with Rabbi Simai. So my benayo, according to Rabbi Yeshivav, what's the difference between Rabbi Shimon Timni and Shimon ben Manasseh? So we'd have to say that the Ika benayo is chivei, or on top of Lamed Amud Aleph. The difference between them is chayvei asrei mitzri ve'adomi. The difference between them is if you violate the positive, a prohibition, it's allowed by Mikol say, the positive commandment of marrying an Egyptian in the first or second generation. So that's not a prohibition. That's just not a straight prohibition. It's a lava b'mikol say. So therefore, the marriage would be binding, and the offspring would not be a mamzer, according to Rabbi Akiva. So that's where Shimon HaTimni would say that you pay the kinas, and Shimon Ben Assi would say you don't. So Gemara says, Hani chol Rabbi Yeshevav. This makes sense according to Rabbi Yeshevav. If he's trying to exclude us from the position of Rabbi Simai, well then Shapir makes sense. Not only time at the but if he's just saying his own opinion and he's not coming to just exclude the position of Rabbi Simai, so if that's the case, when he says Kol she'en bia b'Yisrael avad mamzer va'afilu chayvei asay, and that includes even the positive commandments. Well, if that's the case, my benayu. So what's the difference between Shimon HaTimni and Shimon Ben Assi? The Gemara says, well, there's another possible difference. Ika benayu, the distinction would be be'ula kohen gadol. The difference between them would be a case of a kohen gadol who marries a girl who's not a virgin, that there is a positive commandment that it says besua yikach, and he has to marry a virgin. So if he marries a non-virgin, he's violating the positive commandment. And so therefore, that's the case where Shimon HaTimni would say he pays the knas, Shimon Ben Assi would say he doesn't. The Gemara says, well, what's the difference? Why you would say that this is what Rabbi Shevav says, that the offspring is not a mamzer, whereas in the case of the Egyptian and the Edomite convert who he marries, he says he is. What's the difference? Because this is a more limited positive commandment. This only applies to the Kohen Gadol. It's not applicable to everyone. Whereas the Mitzvah and the Domi applies to everyone. So therefore, that's why Rabbi Akiva would exclude this case and say, in this case, if the Kohen Gadol marries a non-virgin, the offspring is not a mamzer. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, Kol Modim. So Rav Chisda says, everybody admits, Bibal Anida, that if a person assaults a woman who's a menstrual woman, Shemeshayim Kanas, that even though if you have relations with such a woman, you're liable for kares, with death from heaven, but nevertheless, in this case, you have to pay the penalty. Why? According to Shimon HaTimni, who says it has to be a woman with whom the marriage is binding. Well, here too, the marriage is binding. According to one who says it needs to be a marriage that's capable of enduring, this marriage is also capable of enduring. The Gemara says, and our Mishnah, going back to our Mishnah, which says that you pay the kinas in the case of a man who assaults a mamzeres or a sister, is excluding the position of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Because what's Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana's position? Titania, we learned in the Braisa, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says Yom Kippurim kashabos l'tashlumin. And if you violate, so as a background, there's a principle called kimle v'deravmine, that when you do one action and it's potentially liable for two separate penalties, we give you only the more severe penalty. Kimle, give b'deravmine, give him the more severe one. So there's a dispute. Do we apply this also to cases where the penalty comes not from a human court, but also from a heavenly court? So there's a human court penalty of death from heaven, and also, let's say, this kinas, this penalty. So you would only give the person the death from a court and this kinas. You'd only give the person the more severe penalty of death by the court. But what about in the case where the more severe penalty is not death from a human court, but death from heaven, like kares or misa b'dei shamayim? So that, or death from heaven, which is a little bit less severe than kares, even though the Gemara doesn't 100% define kares, but it's considered the most severe penalty. You're cut off. So, Gemara says, we learned in the Braisa that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akasa would say that Yom Kippur is like Shabbos l'tashlumin. When it comes to penalty, Yom Kippur is like Shabbos. And if you violate Shabbos, you get stoning. And so therefore, if there's a monetary penalty associated with your action, you wouldn't pay it. And Yom Kippur, the violation, when you violate Yom Kippur, it's kares. And so therefore, there's also no monetary penalty associated with it because you're getting kares. So the Gemara explains, "Ma Shabbos." This says the Brayta, "Ma Shabbos mitzlayv b'nafsho patur min hatashlumin." Just like a Shabbos, if you violate Shabbos, you're liable for Shabbos, but you're exempt from making a payment. Av Yom Kippurim, so too Yom Kippur, mitzlayv b'nafsho patur min hatashlumin. Just so too in Yom Kippur, you're liable for violating Yom Kippur, but you're exempt from making the payment. And my time at Rabbi Nechanya ben Akana. What is the principle behind Rabbi Nechanya ben Akana's reasoning that when you violate a kares penalty, you do not get a monetary liability at the same time? So we have two approaches. The first approach is of Abaye, and then we're going to see the approach of Rava. Abaye says, "Nemar ason bidei adam, v'nemar ason bidei shemayim." It says the word ason. If two people are fighting and they strike, one man strikes the other, and the lo yeh ason, and if she doesn't die, then he has to pay for the fetus, the damage he did to the fetus. Which means that if the mother would die, he wouldn't have to pay for the fetus. That's because he's getting the punishment of death because he killed the mother. So we see then he doesn't have a monetary penalty. So it says ason bidei shemayim, and that's ason by a man, and never ason bidei shemayim. And it also says the word ason in the penalty is something that comes from heaven. Ma ason amor bidei shemayim, just like when the ason comes bidei adam, like where you strike this person, patur min hatashlumin, and where you strike the woman, you're exempt from making the payment. So too, af ason amor bidei shemayim. So too, when the ason is something that happens from heaven, you're going to be exempt from the tashlumin, patur min hatashlumin. So that's Abaye's logic. So Ma'aske for Ravada Barava. So Ravada Barava challenges this case. He challenges Abaye's explanation. He says, so what's the example of the ason that comes from heaven? That's the ason in the reference to Jacob saying, don't bring Benjamin down to Egypt to see Joseph because I'm worried ukaro ason baderach. I'm worried an accident will befall him. And we assume that was an accident from heaven. So Ravada Barava challenges Abaye. How do we know that when Jacob warns his sons, he was warning them about an accident coming from heaven? How do we know? How do we know he's warning them about the temperature, the heat, or the cold, which are actions coming from heaven? Maybe he's warning them about lions and robbers, that these are things that are attacks that come from man. How do we know it's an ason bidei shemayim? The Gemara says, well, obviously, Atu Yaakov aha isir ahalo asir. You think Yaakov was only warning them about one and not the other? Yaakov akol mili isir. Yaakov warned them about everything, and so therefore we're going to say it's also an ason bidei shemayim. So the Gemara asks, Utzinim upachem bidei shemayim. They knew, are the heat and the cold really heavenly pitfalls? We have a brisa. We already had this in Bava Metzia, Bava Basra. We're going to get to this there, and Avodah Zarah. But the brisa says everything's from heaven except for the heat and the cold, because you can take precautions. Yeah, the person who is guarding his soul will distance himself from the heat and the cold. So, Visu, and furthermore, so we see that the heat and the cold, excuse me, the heat and the cold is not bidei shemayim. It's not from heaven. It's from man to protect himself against it. And furthermore, aryeh v'ganavi bidei adam. You think a robber or a lion is an attack from a man? No, those are from God. Because when the temple was destroyed, even though the Sanhedrin was ceased to exist, God still has his way. God still has God's way of giving us these four major deaths. So the Gemara says the four types of deaths are still applicable. We no longer, the courts don't stone people to death anymore. Ella, so rather, says the Gemara, Din arba misus lo batu. The law of the four types of death was not nullified. Mishin is chayav skiwa, one who is liable for stoning onofel minagag. Either he would, if this person is liable from stoning, we're on top of lamed on the base. Onofel minagag. God is going to arrange it that I'll fall from a roof. Ochaya derasto. Wild animal tear them apart. Meaning to say that these things which we think are pitfalls that come from man, they're really coming from God. And so too, Mishan is chayav streifa. Somebody who's liable for burning. Onofel b'dleika. He's going to fall into a fire. Or a snake will bite him. Mishan is chayav hariga. Somebody who's liable for execution. Onimsar malchus. He'll be handed over to the enemy kingdom. A listin b'analav. The robbers will attack him. Mishan is chayav chanek, and somebody who's liable for strangulation. Otovea benari will either drown, omeis pisaruniki, or will die from this disease called ascaria, where you're like choked to death, kind of. So we see from here that lions and robbers could be from man, and heat and cold. Lions and robbers could be from God, and heat and cold could be from man. Ela epoch. So the Gemara says to reverse it. Are you ganavi b'deishim? I haven't seen him tachim b'dei adam. Okay, Gemara says, okay, you're right. Lions and robbers are from heaven, and heat and cold is from God. So anyway, that's Abaye's answer. Abaye says, how do we know? How does Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana know that by a kares penalty you also have part of the principle of kimlei b'derami? Now he does it by comparing the words ason. So the Gemara says that Rava comes along and Rava says, no, I'll give you a different explanation from Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Taima the Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana mehacha. It's based upon a verse that refers to the prohibition of moech. It says in Leviticus, if the people will pretend they don't see when the man is placing his daughters and giving them to moech, and he's sacrificing his child, and I will place my face upon this man and his family, and I will cut him off. So I will give this person karet. Amra Torah, so Torah is saying, karet shali. So the verse is saying that, so anyway, we see from this verse that the karet is coming to replace the death of the court, because he's saying, if you don't kill him, you're supposed to put this man to death, but if you don't kill him, I'll put him to death. I'll give him the karet. So we say that, so as Rashi says, that we learn from here, shakaret become bimkom mita v'chilufa, that the karet is coming to replace the death and to be its exchange. So karet is the equivalent of the death from the human court. So we see from here as follows. Amar Torah, karet shali kamisa shalchem. The Torah is saying, my karet is like your death from the court. Ma mita shalchem. And so therefore, then we apply this principle. Just like your death, pater minat tashlumin, just like your death, you're going to be exempt from having to make the payment. Av karet shali pater minat tashlumin. Also, my karet, you're going to be exempt from, if you have a penalty that's karet, you're exempt from the monetary payment. Okay, so we see that Rava gave the answer from the Malaim Talimu, where we compare karet to death and to death from a court, and Abaye gave the answer from ason, where we're saying that this principle of kimlei b'deramine applies to the, just like it applies in the case of a punishment from a human court, so too it applies in the case of a heavenly punishment. So Gemara says, well, ma'ika ben Rava Abaye. Is there a distinction between the different verses that Rava and Abaye brought? The Gemara says, ika ben el. Yeah, there of course is a difference. It's a zar shachal truma. If it's a non-Kohen who eats the truma, which we know that a non-Kohen who intentionally eats from the truma is going to get death from heaven, not karet, but a lesser form of penalty than karet, but death from heaven. Karet is more severe. You're cut off. You also die, but it's more severe. This is a lesser form of penalty. It's called death from heaven. So Rashi says as follows: "B'mezid hu b'mita b'dei shamayim v'lo b'karet." if you do it intentionally, you get death from heaven and not karet. What is karet? Karet, who vizaron and noshin. Rashi says by karet, he and his seed are both punished because it says aririmi you will be childless. So basically, both by karet, the punishment is upon him and his seed, as opposed to the death from heaven is just upon him. So if a non-Kohen eats truma, Abaye Potter, according to Abaye, you're going to be exempt from the monetary penalty because we'll apply kimle b'deramine, because the verse son is not a reference specifically to karet. It's any heavenly punishment. So therefore applies even to regular death from heaven, whereas Rava chayev. Rava says it specifically. Rava says that the Kimle b'deramine is specifically about kares, but not about other deaths from heaven. So therefore, in this case, because Rava is citing the verse of v'hichrati, that it says in the verse v'hichrati oto. That means specifically about kares, but the other penalties we would say Kimle b'deramine doesn't apply. So if a non-Kohen eats the truma, Abaye says you'd be exempt from a monetary payment to the Kohen, whereas Rava says you would not. So the Gemara says, well, Abaye Pater, are you really exempt according to Abaye? Amar Rav Chisda, doesn't Rav Chisda teach us? Moder Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana admits he says, is Abaye really exempt? But doesn't Rav Chisda say, Moder Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana admits, V'gonev chalbo shel chavero v'achlo shu chayev. Doesn't Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana admit that if somebody steals the, again, we're questioning the principle that we just said, that Abaye says that if you eat the truma, if a non-Kohen eats the truma, that you're going to be exempt because of the principle of kimle b'deramine does not applies even by a case of death from heaven. So even where it's not kares. So the Gemara says, does Abaye really say you're exempt? Amar Rav Chisda taught. And Mod Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, the Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, who says we apply kimle b'deramine even by kares, or according to Abaye, even by death from heaven. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana would admit that you are liable to pay the fine in the case of begonav chalvo shel chavero v'achlo shel chayev. In the case where you steal your friend's chaylev. Now the punishment for eating chaylev is kares. So where you steal your friend's chaylev and then you eat it, you're going to be liable. Why? Because the two acts do not happen simultaneously. That you're liable for the chaylev for theft before you eat it. So since they're not simultaneous, then for this reason you have to pay for stealing, and then you get kares for eating it. So we see from here, Alma de Meina de Egbaye Kanya. And so therefore we see from the moment you picked up the chaylev, you've acquired it, you've stolen it. And Mischayev benafsha, whereas the theft, lo have ada achile. You're not liable whereas you're not liable for eating the chaylev, for eating the kares, until you actually eat it. So therefore, the two acts are not simultaneous. So Hachanami, here too by the Truma, asks Rav Chisda, hold on. So too, in this case also, asks the Gemara based upon Rav Chisda, so too in this case, Be'ina digbaya, the moment you pick up the Truma, Kanya, you've acquired the Truma, and you've stolen it from the Kohen. You're not liable for eating the truma. You're not liable to death from heaven until you actually eat it. So therefore, why would Abaye say that you're exempt from having to pay for the truma? The two acts don't happen simultaneously. So the Gemara says, no, Hachmai Askinan. No, what we're talking about here is Kigon Shentachavo Chavero. No, your friend stuck the truma into your mouth. You never picked it up. You never stole it from the Kohen. You never acquired it. And so therefore, since their friend stuck it into your mouth, that's the moment of the acquisition, and that's the moment. And that's the moment where you eat it. So it is a simultaneous act. Look at Rashi. Below Kanya. You didn't pick it up. You never acquired it. And you're only liable to pay back the Kohen so once you swallowed it. That's our mischayev. And what are you liable for? The mei haniyas me'av. You're liable for the amount that your body benefits from it. Below to make cool, you don't have to pay for all of it because at that moment its value is depreciated because which is worth more, a loaf of bread in the supermarket or a loaf of bread that's already inside your mouth. Obviously, the loaf of bread inside the supermarket is worth more, but in this case, you still have to pay. You have to pay for the value of what it's in your mouth. So it is simultaneous. You're getting the benefit from the food at the same time that you're getting. At the same time that you're eating it, and so therefore you're liable for death, but not for the consumption of the food. So the Gemara says, well, but still, even though he say, Kanya, Mislav and Avshay go have ad the boa. So the Gemara says, but still, it's still not simultaneous. You're not actually liable until you swallow the food, but once you start chewing the food, you've acquired it. So the two acts are not simultaneous. So the Gemara explains, Kigon, Shetachavo Beisa Buya. No, that he stuck it all the way down his throat. So therefore, the two acts are simultaneous. He never chewed it. Where it says, well, what are we looking at here? What's the scenario? If he could actually spit it back out, well, then that's what he should have done. And and if he wasn't able to spit it back out, why is he liable? Look at the Rashi. He should have spit it back out. And from the moment he doesn't spit it back out, he shata, that's the moment that he's damaging the Kohen. The Rishon Lav Midei Avid, because the first person didn't do anything, and therefore the first person who stuck it down his throat is not liable, but this guy, he could have spit it back out, he's liable. Misa, why is he liable for death? Anasu, the person pushed it down him, and so therefore it should be only liable for the payment, not for for anything really, because the guy pushed it down his throat. So therefore we have to say, Kigon. Well, the Gemara explains, he could have spit it back up, but only with great difficulty. Rashi says, that if he would have spit it back up, Mima'asa would be repulsive, and the owners would not want it back. So therefore, he hasn't really stolen it. And what are you making him liable for? When you say that he has to pay for the value, what would you make him pay for? At that moment, his liability for debt. So therefore, he's exempt from tashlumin. So that's the first answer, that he could have spit it back, but only under great duress. Rav Papa says, Papa says it's where his friend poured liquid down his throat. And so therefore, it doesn't have to be where he poured it all the way down, but rather the moment it went into his mouth, it became repulsive. And so therefore, you can't obligate him on account of theft because it's at this point, it's not worth anything. So what does he have to pay? The value of what he benefits from drinking that. That's what he should be liable. And so therefore, that the death and the liability come at the same time, and so therefore you don't pay for it. Whereas Rav Ashi says, now we're talking about a case where a non-Kohen ate his own truma. How can a non-Kohen have truma? His father was a Kohen and his father bequeathed it to him, so he didn't steal anything from anybody else. So it wasn't a case of theft. Vikara shirayin shel chavero, and at the moment he swallows it, he actually is tearing his friend's garment at the moment he swallows it. And so therefore, Rashi explains, Afagav Demisa La Mishum Mona, Dinezik Asila Miftar, Visvil Ravashi, Misa Lazet, Tashum Lazet Pater. Even though the two acts are not simultaneously, and the death is not coming from anything related to the liability for money, nevertheless, Ravashi would say that you're exempt and from the monetary payment, because these are the position that if you damage one person and you have death for a different act, but they happen simultaneously, you're exempt from the monetary payment. And this is obviously a very, very controversial extension of this position of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, but that's what Rashi says. Rashi is the last generation of Gamoraim, so by that time already this idea is being extended and extended and extended. Okay, hold on one second. We will stop here.